You're here because something inside you is ready to shift. Maybe you're lying in bed, staring at the ceiling, replaying the same worries you had yesterday. Maybe you're tired of feeling stuck in patterns that no longer serve you. Maybe you've tried to change before, and it felt like pushing a boulder uphill, only to watch it roll back down. This audiobook isn't about forcing yourself to become someone new by sunrise. It's not about toxic positivity or pretending everything is fine when it's not. It's about something quieter, something deeper, about understanding how your brain actually works, and using that knowledge to create space for something different to emerge. You might be listening because you're exhausted from battling your own thoughts. You might be here because you've heard about neuroplasticity, the brain's ability to rewire itself, and you're curious whether it's real, whether it's possible for you. You might simply be looking for relief from the mental loops that keep you awake at night. That here's what this journey is. It's a gentle, evidence-based exploration of how your brain forms patterns, why those patterns feel so permanent, and how you can begin to shift them, not through willpower alone, but through understanding and intention. Here's what this journey is not. It's not a quick fix. It's not a demand that you wake up transformed. It's not going to shame you for being human, for having struggled, for being exactly where you are right now. Throughout this audiobook, you'll encounter optional reflection points. These are invitations, not assignments. If you want to pause and think deeply, you can. If you want to write something down, you can. If you simply want to keep listening and let the ideas wash over you, that's perfectly fine too. There's no wrong way to experience this. Over the next hour, we'll move through 8 chapters together. Each one explores a different dimension of how your brain can change. We'll begin by understanding what rewiring actually means, not as a metaphor, but as a biological reality. We'll explore why your current patterns exist, not to judge them, but to understand them with compassion. We'll look at the science of sleep and consolidation and why this particular window of time, before morning, matters. We'll discover how attention shapes your neural pathways, how emotion creates lasting change, how language rewires thought, how movement shifts your brain, and how connection to something larger than yourself creates the conditions for transformation. That be why the time we reach the final chapter, you won't have all the answers. But you'll have something more valuable, a map, a set of gentle practices, a new way of understanding yourself. And here's the beautiful truth. Your brain is already changing. Right now, as you listen, neurons are firing, connections are forming, pathways are being reinforced or allowed to fade. You don't have to force this process. You simply have to allow it, guide it, work with it rather than against it. Take a breath. Get comfortable, whether you're lying down, sitting quietly, or walking through the night. Know that you're exactly where you need to be. Let's begin this journey together. Chapter 2. Why your brain built the patterns you're trying to escape. He couldn't remember when he started doing it. The thing where he'd check his email 30 times a day, even though nothing urgent was ever there. The compulsive refreshing. The way his heart would speed up slightly each time he opened the app, bracing for something bad. Even though bad news rarely came. It annoyed him. It distracted him from work. His partner had commented on it more than once. "You're always on your phone," she'd say, not accusingly, just observing. And she was right. But every time he tried to stop, every time he told himself he'd check just twice a day, he'd find himself back in the app within an hour, scrolling, searching, waiting for something he couldn't quite name. What he didn't understand was that this pattern wasn't a character flaw. It wasn't weakness or lack of discipline. It was his brain doing exactly what brains are designed to do, trying to keep him safe based on information from his past. This chapter is about understanding where your patterns came from, not to excuse them, but to approach them with the compassion that makes change possible. Your current patterns, even the ones causing you pain, were created by a brain trying to protect you. This is the single most important thing to understand about rewiring. Every anxiety loop, every avoidance behavior, every self-sabotaging habit was installed for a reason. And until you understand that reason, you'll keep fighting yourself instead of working with yourself. Why does this matter? Because shame and self-judgment actually prevent neuroplastic change. When you hate yourself for a pattern, when you call yourself weak or broken or fundamentally flawed, you activate your brain's threat response. And a brain in threat mode doesn't learn new patterns. It doubles down on old ones because they feel safer, more familiar, more survivable. But when you approach your patterns with curiosity instead of criticism, when you ask, "Why did my brain create this?" instead of "What's wrong with me?" something shifts. You move out of threat mode and into learning mode. And learning mode is where neuroplasticity happens. Now let's talk about how patterns form. Your brain has one primary job: keep you alive. Everything else is secondary. And to do this job efficiently, it's constantly looking for patterns in your environment and creating automatic responses to handle them. When you were younger, maybe you learned that being perfect meant getting love and approval. So your brain created a pattern: strive for perfection, avoid mistakes at all costs, constantly monitor for any sign of falling short. This pattern kept you safe in that environment. It got you the approval you needed to survive. Or maybe you learned that expressing needs led to disappointment or rejection. So your brain created a different pattern: suppress your needs, be self-sufficient, don't burden others. Again, this pattern served you. It protected you from pain. Or maybe you experienced something unpredictable or scary, and your brain decided that constant vigilance was the answer. So it installed a pattern of hyper-awareness, always scanning for danger, never fully relaxing. In that context, this made sense that here's what matters. These patterns worked. They helped you navigate your circumstances. They got you through. Your brain deserves credit for that, not criticism. But here's what also matters. Circumstances change. You grow up. You leave that environment. The threats that were real then aren't real now. But the patterns remain because your brain doesn't automatically update its operating system. It keeps running the old software because that software has a proven track record. It kept you alive this long, so why change it? This is why that man keeps checking his email compulsively. Years ago, maybe he had a job where missing an email actually had serious consequences. Or maybe he grew up in an environment where bad news came suddenly, without warning, and being vigilant gave him a sense of control. His brain learned: stay alert, keep checking, don't be caught off guard. The pattern made sense then. It doesn't serve him now, but his brain doesn't know that. It just knows this behavior equals safety. So it keeps prompting him to do it, over and over, through the mechanism of anxiety. The slight discomfort when he hasn't checked, the relief when he does. These feelings are his brain's way of reinforcing the pattern. Most people, when they understand this, have the same reaction. Okay, so I know why the pattern exists. But I still hate it. I still want it gone. And that's understandable. But here's where most people get stuck. They try to force the pattern to disappear through sheer willpower. They shame themselves for having it. They view it as an enemy to be defeated, This approach almost never works. You know why? Because you can't fight your brain and win. Your brain controls everything: your emotions, your impulses, your automatic responses. When you declare war on a pattern, you're essentially declaring war on yourself. And in that war, the pattern usually wins because it's been there longer, it's more automatic, and it has the weight of survival behind it. Oh, what's the alternative? You start by acknowledging the pattern without judgment. You literally say to yourself, "This pattern exists. It's here for a reason. Some part of me created it trying to help." This isn't about making excuses. It's about creating the psychological safety that allows change to happen. Then you get curious. Not in a therapeutic way where you need to excavate every childhood trauma, but in a simple, practical way. When does this pattern show up? What triggers it? What does it feel like in my body? What thoughts accompany it? You're gathering information, like a scientist studying an interesting phenomenon. The simplest version of working with a pattern is this: notice it without judging it. Every time you catch yourself in the old pattern, checking email compulsively, people pleasing, catastrophizing, whatever it is, you simply note it. There it is again. Not, "I'm so stupid for doing this again." Just there it is. This simple act of noticing interrupts the autopilot. You're bringing conscious awareness to something that's been running unconsciously. And conscious awareness is the first requirement for change. The everyday version might look like this. You notice you're doing the pattern. You pause for just a moment. You take one conscious breath. You acknowledge, "My brain is trying to keep me safe right now." Then you make a choice. Do I follow this pattern, or do I try something different? Sometimes you'll follow the pattern, and that's okay. You're not trying to be perfect. You're building awareness. But sometimes you'll try something different. You'll not check the email for another hour. You'll express the need instead of suppressing it. You'll let yourself be imperfect and see what happens. Each time you choose differently, you're creating a new data point for your brain. You're showing it, "Look, we tried something different, and we survived. In fact, we were okay." Your brain starts to learn. Maybe the old pattern isn't the only way. Maybe there are other options. The deeper version involves understanding the emotion underneath the pattern. Most problematic patterns are driven by a specific feeling we're trying to avoid, usually some form of fear, shame, or grief. The compulsive email checking might be driven by fear of being blindsided. The perfectionism might be driven by shame about not being enough. The self-sabotage might be driven by a grief you've never let yourself feel. When you can sit with the underlying emotion, even for a few seconds, even if it's uncomfortable, you begin to dissolve the pattern's power. Because the pattern's job is to keep you from feeling that emotion. If you can feel it and survive it, the pattern has less purpose. This doesn't mean drowning in emotion. It means acknowledging it. There's fear here. There's shame underneath this. I'm grieving something, and this pattern is how I've been avoiding that grief. Just naming it, bringing it into awareness, creates space. Tonight, before you sleep, you might try this. Think of one pattern you've been judging yourself for. Not to fix it, just to understand it. Ask yourself, what was happening in my life when this pattern formed? What was it trying to protect me from? What would have happened if I didn't have this pattern back then? You might not have answers right away. That's okay. You're planting seeds of understanding. And understanding, coupled with compassion, is what allows your brain to finally relax its grip on patterns that no longer serve you. Optional pause. If you want to reflect, consider this question. What pattern have I been harshest with myself about? And what might that pattern have been trying to protect? You may write, think, or simply keep listening. There's no pressure to have profound insights. Here's the gentle truth. Your brain created these patterns when it didn't have better options. Now you're giving it better options, not by hating the old patterns, but by understanding them, thanking them for their service, and slowly, patiently, teaching your brain that there are new ways to stay safe. This process takes time. The patterns didn't form overnight, and they won't disappear overnight. But every moment of compassionate awareness is a moment of rewiring. Every time you see the pattern clearly without spiraling into self-judgment, you're teaching your brain something new, and tonight, while you sleep, that learning will consolidate. The new pathway, the one where you meet yourself with understanding instead of criticism, will strengthen. Slowly, the old pattern will loosen its hold. You don't have to trust me. Just notice what happens over time. Notice if the patterns start to have a little less grip. Notice if you start to have a little more choice. That's your brain rewiring itself, one night at a time. Take a breath. When you're ready, let's continue to the next chapter. Chapter 3. The doorway between wake and sleep. She had read somewhere that the moments before sleep were important, but she'd never understood why. Every night, she'd lie there waiting for sleep to take her, sometimes for minutes, sometimes for hours. Her mind would race. Her body would tense. She'd try different techniques, counting backward from 100, imagining peaceful scenes, focusing on her breath. And sometimes they worked, sometimes they didn't. What she didn't know was that she was missing the entire point. Those moments before sleep weren't just a waiting room for unconsciousness. They were a doorway, a specific state of consciousness where the brain becomes uniquely malleable, where suggestion sinks in deeper, where change happens more easily than at almost any other time. This chapter is about learning to recognize that doorway and step through it intentionally. There's a state your brain passes through between wakefulness and sleep called the hypnagogic state. It usually lasts just a few minutes, and most people barely notice it. But in those few minutes, something remarkable happens. Your conscious mind starts to relax its control, your critical thinking softens, and your brain becomes extraordinarily receptive to new information. Why does this matter? Because this is when you have the most direct access to the deeper parts of your mind, the parts that control your automatic responses, your emotional patterns, your habitual ways of being. During full wakefulness, you're largely at the mercy of your established neural pathways. During sleep, you have no conscious input at all. But in that threshold state, you have both enough consciousness to be intentional and enough openness for that intention to sink in deep. Think of your waking mind as a gatekeeper. It evaluates everything. Is this true? Does this make sense? Do I believe this? This is useful during the day. It keeps you from being manipulated or misled. But it also makes change difficult because it rejects information that doesn't match your existing beliefs about yourself. You tell yourself, I am capable, while fully awake, and the gatekeeper says, really? Remember that thing you failed at last week. Remember all the evidence that you're not capable. The new belief bounces off, but in the hypnagogic state, the gatekeeper is drowsy. It's not entirely gone, but it's not working full-time either. Information can slip past it more easily. Not in a dangerous way. You're not vulnerable to manipulation. But in a powerful way. You're open to reprogramming yourself. This is why autosuggestion, visualization, and intention setting have been practiced for thousands of years across different cultures. Not because they're magic, but because they work with neuroscience. Your brain, in that threshold state is literally more plastic, more moldable, more ready to form new connections. Most people waste this window. They lie in bed consumed by worry, replaying problems, rehearsing anxieties, and their brain, in its most suggestible state, is taking notes. Okay, we're worried about this. Better make sure we worry about it tomorrow too. Strengthen that worry circuit. Or they fall asleep watching television, scrolling through social media, their last conscious moments filled with whatever random content happened to be on their screen. Their brain tries to make sense of it all, tries to figure out what's important, and mostly just creates noise. But you can use this window intentionally. You can choose what seeds to plant in your mind right before sleep. And because the soil is so fertile at that moment, those seeds take root more easily than they would at any other time. The simplest way to work with the hypnagogic state is to give your mind a specific focus as you drift off. Not something you force, but something you gently hold your attention on. It might be an image, a phrase, a feeling, or even a question. Maybe you choose a simple phrase that represents how you want to feel. I am peaceful, or I am safe, or I trust myself. You don't try to believe it with your critical mind. You just repeat it softly, internally, as you feel yourself starting to drift. Your brain, in its receptive state, begins to explore what that might mean, how that might feel, or maybe you visualize yourself responding differently to a situation that typically triggers you. You don't force the visualization. You just hold it gently, like a possibility. What if next time this happens, I respond with calm? And as you drift toward sleep, your brain begins to create the neural pathways for that calm response. The everyday version might be even simpler. You just set an intention. Tonight, as I sleep, I release what no longer serves me. Or, tonight, my brain strengthens the patterns of peace and lets go of the patterns of anxiety. You're not commanding your brain. You're making a request, and you're making it at the exact moment when your brain is most likely to cooperate. Some people find it helpful to do a brief body scan as they enter this state. Starting at the top of your head, you simply notice each part of your body, inviting it to relax. As you do this, you're shifting from thinking mode to sensing mode, which naturally facilitates the transition into the hypnagogic state. Others prefer to use a technique called witnessing. As you lie there, instead of trying to control your thoughts, you just watch them. You notice thoughts arising and passing like clouds across the sky. There's a thought about work. There's a worry about money. There's a memory from yesterday. You're not engaging with the thoughts, not following them, just observing. This creates a spaciousness that makes the threshold state easier to notice and work with. The deeper version involves learning to prolong the hypnagogic state. Usually it's fleeting. You're awake, then suddenly you're asleep, and you miss the in-between. But with practice, you can learn to hover in that state for longer, using it as a time for deeper reprogramming. You might use this extended time to have a conversation with your subconscious mind. This sounds strange, but it's surprisingly effective. You acknowledge the patterns you want to change, you thank them for trying to protect you, and you introduce new possibilities. I know you've been making me anxious to keep me safe. I appreciate that, but I'm safe now. It's okay to relax. Your rational mind, fully awake, would find this silly. But in the threshold state, something in you responds. You're speaking to the part of your mind that actually controls the patterns you want to change. You might also use this state to process difficult emotions. During the day, we often push feelings away because we need to function. But as you drift towards sleep, you can allow yourself to feel what you've been avoiding. not wallowing in it, just acknowledging it. There's sadness here. I'm letting myself feel it for a moment. Your brain, in its open state, can integrate that emotion instead of creating patterns to suppress it. Tonight, as you prepare for sleep, you might try this. Notice when you start to feel that shift, that softening of the boundary between awake and asleep. Your thoughts might become slightly more dreamlike. Your body might feel heavier. Your sense of time might blur. When you notice that, instead of trying to hurry into sleep, linger there for a moment. In that liminal space, place one gentle intention for what you want your brain to work on overnight. Not a demand, not a desperate plea, just a simple, clear intention. Tonight, I'm strengthening the pattern of self-compassion. Tonight, I'm releasing the need to control everything. Tonight, I'm allowing my nervous system to reset. Then let go. Don't try to make anything happen. Trust that your brain heard you and will do what it does best, rewire itself while you rest. Optional pause. If you want, reflect on this. What is one quality I would like my brain to strengthen tonight? You may write it down, hold it in your mind, or simply continue listening. Whatever feels right for you is exactly right. Here's what's beautiful about this practice. It requires almost no effort. You're going to sleep anyway. You're going to pass through the hypnagogic state anyway. You're simply learning to be present for it and to use it intentionally. And over time, you'll notice that the intentions you plant in that fertile soil begin to grow. Not dramatically, not all at once, but steadily, persistently, the way anything grows when given the right conditions. You might notice that you feel slightly calmer in situations that used to spike your anxiety. You might find yourself responding with more patience when you typically react with frustration. You might discover that certain triggers have lost their intensity without you even consciously working on them. This is the power of working with your brain's natural rhythms instead of against them. You're not forcing change. You're planting seeds at exactly the right time, in exactly the right conditions, and letting your brain's natural processes handle the rest. As you move towards sleep tonight, remember, those moments before you drift off aren't empty waiting time. They're your opportunity to whisper to the deepest parts of yourself, to set the direction for the rewiring that will happen while you rest. Take a breath. When you're ready, let's explore the next chapter. Chapter 4. Attention. The sculptor of your brain. Here was a period in his life when he couldn't stop noticing everything that was wrong. He'd walk down the street and see litter, disrepair, people looking stressed or unhappy. He'd have dinner with friends and notice the awkward moments, the conversational missteps, the subtle tensions. At work, he'd focus on what wasn't done yet, what could go wrong, what he needed to fix. He didn't understand why life felt so heavy, why he felt constantly drained. Everything was actually relatively okay in his life. Good job, good relationships, good health. But it didn't feel okay. It felt like he was drowning in problems. Then someone pointed out something simple but profound. You've trained your brain to look for what's wrong. And brains are very good at finding what they're trained to look for. This chapter is about understanding that your attention isn't neutral. It's the most powerful tool you have for rewiring your brain. Here's the core concept. Whatever you consistently pay attention to becomes stronger in your brain, not because of magic or wishful thinking, but because of a neurological principle called Hebbian learning, often summarized as neurons that fire together, wire together. Every time you direct your attention to something, a thought, a sensation, a perception, an emotion, You're activating specific neurons. When those neurons activate repeatedly, the connections between them strengthen. They become more likely to fire together in the future. They become an established pathway, an automatic pattern. Why does this matter? Because it means that your habitual attention patterns are literally shaping the structure of your brain. If you consistently focus on threats, your brain builds stronger threat detection circuits. If you consistently focus on what's lacking, your brain becomes more efficient at spotting lack. If you consistently focus on what's overwhelming, your brain wires itself for overwhelm. This isn't about positive thinking or denying reality. It's about understanding that your attention is choosing which aspects of reality to strengthen in your neural architecture. Consider the man who sees everything that's wrong. He's not hallucinating those problems. The litter is real. The stress on people's faces is real. The things that aren't done at work are real. But there are also trees blooming on that same street. There are also moments of genuine laughter during that dinner. There are also things going well at work. His brain has been trained to filter for the negative, not because he's a pessimist by nature, but because at some point, focusing on problems felt necessary for survival. Maybe he grew up in an unstable environment where missing a warning sign had consequences. Maybe he learned that finding problems before they found him was a form of protection. So his brain got very good at spotting problems. It built robust neural pathways for threat detection, for noticing what's wrong, for preparing for the worst. And those pathways became so automatic that he stopped realizing he had a choice about where to place his attention. This is how most people live, on autopilot, their attention drawn automatically to whatever their brain has been trained to prioritize. And then they wonder why their experience of life feels so fixed, so unchangeable. But here's the powerful part. You can retrain your attention. And when you do, you literally rewire your brain. Not by ignoring reality or forcing fake positivity, but by consciously choosing to balance your attention, to notice the full spectrum of what's actually present. Most people get this wrong in a specific way. They think retraining attention means trying to think positive thoughts, repeating affirmations, suppressing negative observations. That doesn't work because you can't think your way into different attention patterns. Attention is deeper than thought. It's precognitive. It's where you look before you think about what you're looking at. The simplest practice for retraining attention is this. Multiple times a day, pause and ask yourself, what am I paying attention to right now? Don't judge it. Just notice. I'm paying attention to my anxiety about that meeting. I'm paying attention to how tired I am. I'm paying attention to that thing someone said that annoyed me. Then, gently, see if you can broaden your field of attention. What else is present right now that I'm not noticing? Maybe there's also the feeling of your feet on the ground, solid and stable. Maybe there's also a bird singing outside. Maybe there's also the fact that you have a body that's working, breath moving in and out without you having to think about it, that you're not replacing negative attention with positive attention. You're expanding your attention to include more of what's actually real. Because both are real, the difficulty and the resource, the problem and the okayness. Your brain has just been trained to spotlight one and ignore the other. The everyday version of this practice looks different depending on your pattern. If your attention habitually goes to what's overwhelming, you practice noticing what's manageable right now, not ignoring the overwhelm, but acknowledging that both exist simultaneously. If your attention habitually goes to what others think of you, you practice noticing, what do I think of this situation? You're training your brain to include your own perspective, not just your imagination of others' judgments that continue. If your attention habitually goes to what you haven't accomplished, you practice noticing, what did I actually do today? Again, not pretending the undone things don't exist, but training your brain to register both sides of reality. This might sound simple, but the effects are profound. Every time you deliberately shift your attention, you're weakening old neural pathways and strengthening new ones. You're teaching your brain that there are other things worth noticing besides what it's been fixated on. The deeper version involves understanding that attention has layers. There's the content you're paying attention to, the thought, the sensation, the perception. But there's also the quality of attention itself. Are you paying attention with judgment or curiosity? With anxiety or ease? With contraction or openness? Two people can pay attention to the exact same thing, say, a mistake they made, and have completely different neural responses based on the quality of their attention. One person pays attention to the mistake with harsh self-criticism. Their brain registers threat, activates the stress response, strengthens the neural pathways associated with shame and fear of failure. The other person pays attention to the same mistake with curious self-reflection. Their brain stays in learning mode, integrates the information, strengthens the pathways associated with growth and adaptation. Same content, different quality of attention, completely different rewiring. So part of training attention is training the quality of the attention itself. This is where practices like mindfulness become neurologically powerful. You're not just noticing what you're noticing. You're noticing with a particular quality, open, non-judgmental, allowing. When you bring this quality of attention to difficult experiences, something remarkable happens. The experiences don't necessarily go away, but they stop creating harmful patterns in your brain. You can feel anxiety without wiring yourself for more anxiety. You can notice pain without strengthening pain circuits. You're creating space around the experience, and that space prevents the experience from becoming a rigid pattern. Here's a practice you can try tonight, before sleep. Do a simple inventory of where your attention went today. Not to judge yourself, just to notice. Today, my attention was drawn to worries about money, that comment my coworker made, how tired I felt, and that news article that made me angry. Then notice, what didn't I pay much attention to? Maybe you didn't notice the moment of connection with a stranger. Maybe you didn't notice the taste of your food. Maybe you didn't notice the 3 things that actually went smoothly today. Maybe you didn't notice moments of simple physical comfort, the warmth of your shower, the softness of your chair. Again, you're not trying to force yourself to pay attention to positive things. You're just seeing clearly where your attention naturally flows and recognizing that there were other things present that you filtered out. Then, as you prepare for sleep, set an intention for tomorrow's attention. Tomorrow, I'm going to practice noticing what's stable, not just what's changing. Or, tomorrow, I'm going to practice noticing my own needs, not just everyone else's. Or, tomorrow, I'm going to practice noticing when I feel okay, not just when I feel stressed. You're giving your brain a clear directive. And because you're setting this intention right before sleep, in that receptive threshold state we talked about, it has a better chance of actually influencing your attention patterns tomorrow. Over time, this practice creates profound change. You start to notice that your default attention patterns are shifting. Things that used to consume your mental space start to have less grip. You find yourself naturally noticing aspects of experience you previously filtered out. A woman who practiced this told me that after several weeks, she was driving through her neighborhood. the same route she'd driven 1,000 times, and suddenly noticed flowers blooming in someone's yard. "They've probably been blooming for days," she said. "But my attention was always on traffic, on getting where I needed to go, on my mental to-do list. I literally wasn't seeing the flowers even though they were right there." That's a small example, but it represents something significant. Her brain was rewiring. The neural pathways for noticing beauty, for registering pleasant sensory information, for being present to her immediate environment. These pathways were strengthening because she'd been deliberately practicing directing her attention there. And here's what happened as those pathways strengthened. She felt better. Not because her life circumstances changed. Not because she suddenly had less stress or fewer responsibilities. But because her brain was constructing a different experience of reality based on what she was paying attention to. This is what people mean when they talk about attention as the sculptor of your brain. Your brain doesn't respond to all of reality equally. It responds to what you pay attention to. And what you pay attention to, over time, becomes your reality. Not because other things disappear, but because the neural pathways for perceiving and responding to what you focus on become dominant. So, if you've been living in a reality that feels heavy, anxious, overwhelming, or empty, consider this. What has your attention been trained on? What patterns have strengthened because you've been feeding them with your focus? And more importantly, what might shift if you began, very gently, very gradually, to train your attention differently? You don't have to do this perfectly. You don't have to catch every moment your attention drifts to its old patterns. You just have to practice redirecting it occasionally. That's all. A few moments a day where you consciously choose where to place your attention. Those moments add up. Those moments create change. Tonight, as you move towards sleep, you might try this. Instead of letting your mind run its usual pre-sleep program, the worries, the replays, the planning, practice gathering your attention and placing it somewhere intentional. Maybe on the sensation of your breath. Maybe on a memory that makes you feel peaceful. Maybe on gratitude for one small thing. Even just the fact that you have a place to sleep tonight. When your attention wanders, and it will, just gently bring it back. You're not trying to suppress other thoughts. You're training the muscle of intentional attention. You're showing your brain, I can choose where to focus. I'm not at the mercy of automatic patterns. Optional pause. If you want to explore this, ask yourself, where has my attention been spending most of its time lately? Where would I like to direct it instead? You may write, reflect, or continue listening. There's no pressure to have profound insights. Here's the truth that might take time to believe. The quality of your life is, to a large extent, determined by the quality of your attention. Not your circumstances, not your past, not your genetics. Those things matter, but attention matters more because attention determines what you perceive, what you reinforce, what becomes real for you. This isn't about blaming yourself for suffering. If you've been stuck in painful attention patterns, it's because your brain was trained that way, probably for good reasons. But now you're learning to retrain it. Not through force, not through self-criticism, through gentle, repeated practice of noticing and redirecting. And as you sleep tonight, your brain will consolidate this practice. The neural pathways you exercise today, the ones where you noticed your attention and chose to shift it, will strengthen. The old automatic patterns will weaken just slightly. Tomorrow, redirecting your attention might be a tiny bit easier than it was today. That's how rewiring happens. Not in dramatic sudden shifts, but in small consistent practices that compound over time until one day you realize you're experiencing reality differently. Not because reality changed, but because your brain learned to pay attention to different aspects of what was always there. Take a breath. When you're ready, let's move to the next chapter. Chapter 5. Emotion. The accelerator of change. She had been trying to change her relationship with food for years. She'd read books, followed plans, joined programs. She understood nutrition. She knew what she should do. She could explain to anyone the principles of mindful eating, emotional regulation, balanced meals. But every time she had a difficult day, she'd find herself in the kitchen at night, eating quickly, barely tasting, using food to numb feelings she didn't want to feel. And then she'd hate herself for it. The self-hatred would make her feel worse. Feeling worse would make her want to numb again. The cycle continued. What finally changed wasn't more information. It was one night when, instead of eating to avoid her feelings, she sat with them. She let herself feel the loneliness, the grief, the overwhelm. She cried. Her body shook. It was deeply uncomfortable. But when it passed, and it did pass, something in her brain shifted. She'd proven to herself that she could feel difficult emotions and survive them. That single experience did more to rewire her patterns than years of intellectual understanding. This chapter is about why emotion is the accelerator of neural change and how to work with feelings instead of around them. Here's what you need to understand. Information alone rarely changes behavior. You can know something intellectually and still act in complete opposition to that knowledge. You've probably experienced this yourself. You know that worrying doesn't help, but you worry anyway. You know that checking your phone compulsively is making you anxious, but you do it anyway. You know that being harsh with yourself is counterproductive, but the harsh voice continues. Why? Because knowing something cognitively doesn't mean it's wired into the deeper, emotional parts of your brain. And it's those deeper parts, the limbic system, the amygdala, the structures that process emotion and drive behavior, that actually control most of your automatic responses. This is why emotion matters so much for rewiring. When an experience has emotional weight, it gets prioritized for consolidation during sleep. Your brain essentially says, "This was important. This mattered. Let's make sure we remember it and adjust our responses accordingly." Think about it. You probably can't remember what you had for lunch 3 Tuesdays ago, but you can remember, in vivid detail, moments of intense emotion, joy, fear, embarrassment, love from years ago. That's your brain's priority system at work. Emotion signals importance that if you want to rewire your brain, you need to engage emotion in the process, not by forcing feelings, but by allowing yourself to actually feel what's present, especially the feelings you've been avoiding. Most people spend enormous energy avoiding certain emotions: anxiety, sadness, anger, shame, grief. These feelings are uncomfortable, so we develop elaborate strategies to not feel them. We distract ourselves, we numb ourselves, we keep busy, we rationalize them away. But here's what happens when you chronically avoid emotion. Your brain never learns that you can handle it. The avoided emotion becomes more and more threatening. Your brain builds bigger and bigger defenses against it. And those defenses become the patterns that limit your life. The woman who ate to avoid feelings wasn't primarily struggling with food. She was struggling with emotional avoidance. Her brain had learned uncomfortable feelings equals danger, must escape immediately. Food was just the escape route. If it wasn't food, it would have been something else: alcohol, shopping, overworking, endless scrolling. The pattern couldn't change until she was willing to feel what she'd been avoiding. Not because suffering is virtuous, but because her brain needed new data. It needed to learn. Uncomfortable feelings are not actually dangerous. They're uncomfortable, yes, but they don't destroy you. They arise, they peak, they pass. This is one of the most powerful forms of rewiring you can do. Approaching avoided emotions with willingness instead of resistance. The simplest version looks like this. When you notice yourself reaching for a habitual pattern, whatever your version of late-night eating is, pause for just a moment and ask yourself, what am I feeling right now that I don't want to feel? You might not have a clear answer immediately. That's okay. Just asking the question begins to create space between the feeling and the reaction. You're interrupting the autopilot that if you can identify the feeling, try staying with it for just 10 seconds. Not analyzing it, not trying to fix it, just feeling it in your body. Where is it? What does it actually feel like as a physical sensation? Is it tightness in your chest? Heaviness in your stomach? Tension in your shoulders? 10 seconds. That's all. You're teaching your brain. This feeling isn't an emergency. I can be present with it briefly and nothing terrible happens. The everyday version involves building tolerance for emotional discomfort gradually. You don't have to immediately confront your deepest fears or oldest wounds. You can start with mild discomfort. Maybe you practice sitting with mild boredom instead of immediately reaching for your phone. Maybe you practice sitting with slight disappointment when something doesn't go as planned, instead of immediately trying to fix it or distract yourself from it. Maybe you practice noticing irritation without immediately expressing it or suppressing it, just feeling it for a moment. These small practices build emotional capacity. Your nervous system learns to tolerate discomfort. Your brain learns that feelings are information, not threats. The pathways that previously triggered immediate avoidance responses begin to include a pause, a moment of choice. The deeper version involves what some people call emotional completion. Many of the patterns you're trying to change are actually frozen emotional responses from your past. Something happened that generated a strong emotion, but you couldn't fully feel or express it at the time. So it got stuck, incomplete, and your nervous system has been organizing around it ever since. When you finally allow yourself to feel these old emotions, with support, with safety, at your own pace, they complete. They move through you, and the patterns that were built to protect you from feeling them can finally soften. This doesn't always require therapy or formal processing, though those can certainly help. Sometimes it's as simple as letting yourself cry when sadness arises, instead of holding it back. Sometimes it's allowing yourself to shake or tremble when you're frightened, instead of forcing yourself to be still. Sometimes it's expressing anger into a pillow or through movement, instead of clamping down on it. Your body wants to process emotion. That's what emotions are for. They're energy in motion, meant to move through you. When you allow that movement, when you stop blocking it, the energy completes its cycle and dissipates. The pattern that was built around blocking it no longer has a purpose. Here's what's crucial to understand. You don't have to go looking for difficult emotions. You don't have to excavate your past or force yourself to feel things you're not ready to feel. The emotions that need your attention will present themselves. Your job is simply to be willing to feel them when they arise, instead of automatically running away. Tonight, before sleep, you might try a simple practice. Place your hand on your heart. Take a few slow breaths. Ask yourself, what have I been carrying that I'm ready to feel? You might not get an answer. You might get a vague sense of something. You might suddenly feel emotional without knowing exactly why. Whatever arises, let it be there. Don't try to make sense of it or fix it. Just breathe and let yourself feel it for a moment. If tears come, let them. If your breath gets shaky, let it. If you feel nothing, that's fine too. You're not forcing anything. You're just creating a space where emotion is welcome if it wants to show up. This practice signals to your brain, we're safe enough to feel. And safety is the prerequisite for all rewiring. When your nervous system feels threatened, it clings to old patterns because old patterns feel survivable. When your nervous system feels safe, it can risk trying something new. One of the most powerful things you can do for emotional rewiring is to pair difficult feelings with physical safety cues. This is what trauma therapists do, but you can do a simpler version on your own. When you're feeling something uncomfortable, you simultaneously remind your body that you're safe right now. You might place both feet firmly on the ground and notice the stability. You might wrap yourself in a blanket and notice the warmth. You might place a hand on your heart and feel your heartbeat, proof that you're alive. You're here. You're okay, even while feeling this difficult thing. This dual awareness, feeling the emotion while also sensing present safety, teaches your brain something new. It learns, I can feel difficult things and be safe simultaneously. This is radically different from the old pattern where difficult feelings meant danger, which meant urgent escape. Over time, this rewires your emotional responses. Things that used to spike your anxiety start to feel more manageable. Situations that used to trigger shame start to have less charge. You develop what psychologists call emotional regulation, not the ability to suppress emotion, but the capacity to feel it without being overwhelmed by it. And here's what happens when you can feel your emotions without being overwhelmed. They start to give you valuable information. Anxiety tells you something needs attention. Sadness tells you something matters to you. Anger tells you a boundary was crossed. These emotions become guides instead of threats. The woman who changed her relationship with food didn't stop feeling difficult emotions. She still felt lonely sometimes, still felt overwhelmed, still felt grief. But she stopped being afraid of those feelings. And when she wasn't afraid of them, she didn't need to numb them. The compulsive eating pattern lost its purpose. That's the paradox. When you stop fighting your emotions, they stop controlling you. Optional pause. If you want to reflect, consider this. What emotion have I been most afraid of feeling? What would it be like to let myself feel it for just a moment? You may write, think, or simply continue listening. Whatever feels right for you is perfectly fine. As you move towards sleep tonight, know that any emotion you allowed yourself to feel today, even briefly, even partially, is being processed and integrated by your brain right now. You're not just thinking differently, you're feeling differently. And feeling differently is what actually changes behavior. The neural pathways that connect emotion to response are being rewired. Slowly, your brain is learning. I can feel what I feel and choose how I respond. I can be sad and not collapse. I can be anxious and not spiral. I can be angry and not lash out. I can be joyful and not brace for it to be taken away. This is emotional freedom, not the absence of difficult feelings, but the capacity to be with whatever you feel without it dictating your actions. Take a breath. Notice what you're feeling right now. Whatever it is, it's welcome. When you're ready, let's continue to the next chapter. Chapter 6. The language you use with yourself. He didn't think of himself as someone with negative self-talk. He wasn't walking around saying, I hate myself, or anything dramatic like that. but a friend once pointed out how he spoke about his mistakes. "I'm such an idiot," he'd say casually when he forgot something. "Of course I messed that up when something went wrong. I'm the worst at this," when he struggled with a task. "You talk to yourself like you're your own worst enemy," his friend observed. And he laughed it off. It was just how he talked. Self-deprecating humor, not taking himself too seriously. But then he started noticing the casual cruelty he directed at himself dozens of times a day, the harsh narration that accompanied every minor mistake, the way he'd never speak to anyone else the way he spoke to himself internally, and he began to wonder, if his brain is always listening to the language he uses, what is all that language building? This chapter is about how the words you use, especially with yourself, actively shape your neural pathways. Your brain doesn't distinguish between external voices and your internal voice. When you hear someone say, "You're stupid," your brain processes that as a threat, activating stress responses, encoding the message. When you say to yourself, "I'm stupid," the exact same neural mechanisms activate. Your brain believes you. This isn't about positive thinking or affirmations. This is about understanding that language is a tool for shaping neural pathways, and the language you use most frequently is your internal dialogue. Think about how much you talk to yourself. There's a constant stream of narration, commentary, judgment running in your mind. Most of it is so automatic you barely notice it. But it's there, and your brain is absorbing it, responding to it, building pathways based on it. If the dominant narrative is self-critical, "I can't do anything right. I'm always failing. Everyone else has it together except me." Your brain wires itself around those statements. Not because they're objectively true, but because repetition creates neural reality. Your brain is essentially a pattern-matching machine. It looks for evidence to confirm the stories you tell yourself. If you repeatedly tell yourself you're not good enough, your brain becomes highly efficient at spotting all the ways you're not good enough, while filtering out evidence to the contrary. This is called confirmation bias, and it works at the neural level. The pathways that support the dominant narrative get stronger. The pathways that would challenge it get weaker. Over time, the narrative starts to feel like an unchangeable fact about who you are, when really it's just a deeply grooved neural pattern reinforced by repetition. Why does this matter? Because changing the language you use with yourself is one of the most direct ways to rewire your brain. Not by lying to yourself or forcing positive statements you don't believe, but by bringing awareness to the current language and gently shifting towards something more accurate and compassionate. Most people don't realize how distorted their self-talk actually is. They think they're just being realistic or honest. But if you actually examine the language objectively, you'd see it's often catastrophic, absolutist, and cruel in ways that don't match reality. "I always mess things up." Really? Always? Every single thing? Or is it more accurate to say, "I made a mistake in this situation. I'm terrible at relationships." Are you though? Or have you struggled in some relationships while having meaningful connections in others? "Nothing ever works out for me." Nothing? Ever? Or is it that some things haven't worked out the way you wanted? The language of always, never, everyone. No one creates neural pathways of helplessness and permanence. Your brain hears these absolutes and interprets them as unchangeable reality. This triggers resignation, which prevents you from trying, which creates more evidence for the original statement. It's a self-fulfilling prophecy encoded in language. The simplest practice for changing this is to start noticing the language you use with yourself. Not to immediately change it, just to notice. When you catch yourself using harsh, absolute, or catastrophic language, pause and name it. There's that critical voice again. I'm using always language. I'm catastrophizing. Just the act of noticing creates some separation between you and the voice. You begin to see it as a pattern, not as truth. And that tiny bit of separation is where change becomes possible. The everyday version involves experimenting with more accurate language. Not fake positivity, just accuracy. Instead of "I'm such an idiot," you might say, "I made a mistake." Instead of "I can't handle this," you might say, "This is challenging for me right now." Instead of "I'm worthless," you might say, "I'm struggling and that's hard." These aren't affirmations. They're just more truthful statements. And truth, it turns out, is less damaging to your neural pathways than distortion. You might also experiment with speaking to yourself the way you'd speak to someone you care about. If a friend came to you with a problem, you probably wouldn't say, "You're pathetic, just give up." You'd likely offer understanding, encouragement, realistic perspective. Try offering yourself the same. This feels awkward at first. The harsh voice is so familiar that speaking kindly to yourself feels foreign, even fake. But remember, the harsh voice is just as constructed as a kind voice would be. Neither is more real. They're both patterns. You're just so used to one that it feels like your default setting. The deeper version involves understanding where the harsh voice came from. Often it's an internalized version of how someone spoke to you when you were younger. A critical parent, a harsh teacher, a bullying peer. You absorbed their voice and made it your own because, at the time, you didn't know you had a choice. But now you do. You can choose to acknowledge, "This voice isn't actually mine. I inherited it, and I can develop a different internal voice if I practice." Some people find it helpful to actually name the critical voice, to externalize it slightly. There's the judge again. The critic is active right now. This creates even more separation, making it easier to not believe everything the voice says. You can even talk back to the voice, gently but firmly. When it says, "You're going to fail," you might respond internally, "I hear you trying to protect me from disappointment, but I don't need that kind of protection right now." When it says, "You're not as good as everyone else," you might respond, "That's a story, not a fact, and I don't have to believe it." This isn't about getting rid of the critical voice entirely. That's probably not possible, and might not even be desirable, since sometimes it carries useful information about real things that need attention. It's about changing your relationship with it, so it's not the only voice, not the loudest voice, not the voice you automatically believe. Tonight, as you prepare for sleep, you might try this practice. Review your day and notice what language you used with yourself. Were there moments of harsh judgment? Were there moments of kindness? Just notice, without judgment about the judgment. Then, choose one piece of harsh language you used today and rephrase it with accuracy and compassion. If you told yourself, "I'm such a failure," rephrase it. "I'm learning, and sometimes learning involves mistakes." If you told yourself, "Nobody likes me," rephrase it. "I felt disconnected in that interaction, and that hurt." Say the new phrase to yourself a few times as you drift towards sleep. You're not trying to convince yourself it's true. You're just introducing a different possibility, planting a different seed in your mind right before your brain does its consolidation work. Over time, something shifts. The harsh voice doesn't disappear, but it gets quieter. It loses some of its authority, and new voices emerge. Voices of understanding, of encouragement, of realistic hope. One woman described it like this: "I used to have a drill sergeant in my head, screaming at me about everything I did wrong. Now it's more like a coach, still pointing things out, but with the assumption that I'm capable of growth. That's what's possible when you deliberately work with the language you use internally. You're not just changing your thoughts. You're literally rewiring the pathways that determine how you perceive yourself, how you respond to challenges, how much energy you have for growth and change. Because here's the thing, self-criticism might feel like motivation, but neurologically, it activates threat responses. And brains in threat mode don't learn well, don't try new things, don't access creativity or flexibility. They just try to survive. Self-compassion, on the other hand, activates the neural pathways associated with safety and connection. And brains that feel safe are brains that can change, risk, grow, rewired. So every time you speak to yourself with even a little more kindness, even a little more accuracy, even a little less harshness, you're creating conditions for change. You're building neural pathways that support growth instead of pathways that keep you stuck. Optional pause. If you'd like to reflect, consider, what's one phrase I frequently say to myself that's harsher than necessary? How might I rephrase it with accuracy and compassion? You may write, think, or simply continue listening. Whatever feels right for you is perfectly fine. As you sleep tonight, your brain will process the language you've been using with yourself. And if you've begun, even tentatively, to shift that language towards something kinder, that shift will consolidate. The neural pathways of self-compassion will strengthen. The pathways of self-attack will weaken slightly. This is how you change your relationship with yourself, which changes everything else. Because the voice in your head is the voice you hear more than any other. If that voice becomes an ally instead of an enemy, the whole experience of being alive shifts. You deserve to be spoken to kindly, even by yourself. Especially by yourself. Take a breath. When you're ready, let's explore the next chapter. Chapter 7. Movement. Your body rewires your brain. She had tried everything to manage her anxiety. Therapy, medication, meditation apps, breathing exercises. Some things helped a little. Nothing helped enough. The anxiety was still there every morning when she woke up, a tight knot in her chest that followed her through the day. Then someone suggested she try running. She resisted at first. She wasn't athletic. She didn't like exercise. It seemed too simple, too physical for what felt like a mental problem, but she was desperate enough to try. The first few runs were awkward, uncomfortable, but by the third week, she noticed something. After running, the anxiety knot loosened. Not permanently, but for a few hours, she felt lighter. Her thoughts were clearer. The spiral of worry that usually consumed her morning had less grip. She didn't understand the mechanism. She just knew that somehow, moving her body was changing her mind. This chapter is about the profound connection between physical movement and neural rewiring. Your brain doesn't exist in isolation from your body. This seems obvious, but we often forget it. We think of mental and emotional patterns as purely psychological, something happening in our heads. But your brain is constantly receiving input from your body, and that input shapes neural pathways just as powerfully as your thoughts do. When you move your body, especially in specific ways, you trigger a cascade of neurochemical and structural changes in your brain. You increase production of BDNF, brain-derived neurotrophic factor, which is essentially fertilizer for neurons. You enhance blood flow to the brain, delivering more oxygen and nutrients. You stimulate the growth of new neural connections. You activate the release of endorphins, dopamine, and serotonin, the neurotransmitters associated with mood regulation and well-being. Why does this matter? Because it means that changing your physical state is one of the fastest, most reliable ways to shift your mental and emotional state. Not as a temporary distraction, but as actual rewiring. Think about what happens when you're stuck in anxiety or depression or overwhelm. There's usually a physical component: shallow breathing, tense muscles, low energy, a sense of being trapped in your body. Your body and brain are locked in a feedback loop. The mental state creates the physical state, and the physical state reinforces the mental state. Movement interrupts that loop. It gives your brain new input, forces a different physiological state, creates space for different neural pathways to activate. The woman who started running was experiencing this directly. The cardiovascular exercise wasn't just burning off stress hormones, though it was doing that. It was actively building new neural pathways, pathways that didn't include anxiety as the default response. It was teaching her nervous system that there were other states available besides constant vigilance. Most people underestimate how much their mental patterns are maintained by physical patterns. You hold your body in a certain way, shoulders hunched, jaw clenched, breath shallow. And that physical holding creates the neural and hormonal environment for certain mental states. Change the physical holding, and the mental state has to shift. This doesn't mean you can just exercise away depression or dance away trauma. But it does mean that movement is a powerful tool for rewiring, one that works through different mechanisms than cognitive approaches and often reaches patterns that talking and thinking can't touch. The simplest practice is this: when you notice yourself stuck in a difficult mental or emotional pattern, move. Not to escape the pattern, but to give your brain different input. Walk, stretch, dance, shake, jump, anything that shifts your physical state. You don't need to go to a gym or follow a program. Just move. Stand up and stretch your arms overhead. Walk around your room. Do 10 jumping jacks. Roll your shoulders. The specific movement matters less than the fact that you're creating a different physical state. The everyday version involves understanding that different types of movement affect your brain in different ways. Cardiovascular exercise, running, cycling, swimming, tends to reduce anxiety and improve mood through the mechanisms already described. It's particularly good for people stuck in patterns of worry or rumination. Rhythmic, repetitive movement, walking, rocking, swaying, tends to be calming and regulating for the nervous system. It can help when you're overstimulated or your thoughts are racing. Expressive movement, dancing, shaking, any movement that allows emotion to move through your body, tends to help release stuck emotions and complete cycles of stress response that got frozen. Strength training, resistance exercise, yoga, climbing, tends to build a sense of capability and groundedness. It can help with patterns of helplessness or feeling disconnected from your body. You can experiment to see what types of movement are most useful for your particular patterns. But generally, any movement that you do consistently will create positive changes in your brain. Here's something most people don't know. Trauma and chronic stress get stored in the body, not just the mind. Your muscles, your fascia, your nervous system hold patterns of protection and defense that were adaptive at one time, but are now keeping you stuck. Sometimes talking about trauma or difficult experiences isn't enough to process them, because the patterns are encoded below the level of language, in the body itself. Movement can access and release these patterns in ways that words can't. This is why practices like trauma-informed yoga, somatic experiencing, and other body-based therapies have become so important in mental health treatment. They recognize that you have to work with the body to fully rewire patterns that originated in physical threat or stress. But you don't need formal training to work with this. You can practice simple body-based awareness on your own. When you notice tension, instead of trying to mentally relax it, you can move it. You can exaggerate the tension slightly, then release it. You can breathe into it. You can gently move the part of your body that's holding the tension and see what wants to happen. Sometimes when you do this, emotion arises. You might suddenly feel angry or sad or scared without knowing why. That's okay. That's the body releasing what it's been holding. Let it move through. Keep breathing. Keep moving gently. You're completing a cycle that's been interrupted, allowing your nervous system to update its response patterns. The deeper version involves using movement as a language for communicating with the parts of yourself that don't speak in words. Your body knows things your conscious mind doesn't. It knows when you're safe and when you're not. It knows what you need. It carries wisdom that's often drowned out by mental noise. When you move with awareness, when you listen to what your body wants to do rather than forcing it into predetermined patterns, you access that wisdom. You might find yourself spontaneously moving in ways that feel healing, even if you don't understand why. Trust that. Your body is trying to rewire itself, trying to release old patterns and establish new ones. Tonight, before you sleep, you might try this. Lie down and do a slow body scan. Notice where you're holding tension. Instead of trying to relax those areas, gently move them. Maybe your shoulders want to roll. Maybe your hips want to shift. Maybe your feet want to flex and point. Follow what your body wants to do. Then, try a few minutes of gentle movement. Nothing strenuous, just whatever feels good. You might stretch. You might rock slightly side to side. You might curl up and then extend. You're not exercising. You're dialoguing with your body, letting it guide you into the movements that will help it release the day's tension and prepare for the rewiring work of sleep. As you move, breathe fully. Notice how different movements affect your breath, your heart rate, your sense of being in your body. You're gathering information about your physical state, and that awareness itself is rewiring. You're strengthening the neural pathways that connect you to your body, that allow you to sense and respond to physical needs. One man who practiced this told me that after a few weeks, he realized he'd been living almost entirely in his head for years. I could tell you what I was thinking at any moment, he said. But if you asked what I was feeling in my body, I had no idea. I was completely disconnected. As he practiced gentle movement before sleep each night, that connection came back. He started noticing when his jaw was clenched during the day. He started recognizing the physical signs of stress before they became overwhelming. He started responding to his body's signals, resting when he was tired, moving when he was restless, eating when he was actually hungry. This might sound basic, but it was profound. For years, his anxiety had been driving him because he couldn't feel the early warning signs in his body. By the time he recognized he was anxious, he was already spiraling. But as he strengthened the connection between his mind and body through movement, he could catch the anxiety earlier, when it was just a sensation of tightness or shallow breathing, and he could respond differently. That's what movement gives you. Not just temporary relief, but actual rewiring of the pathways that connect your brain to your body. And those pathways are fundamental to how you experience everything. There's also something powerful about the simple fact of agency that movement provides. When you're stuck in difficult mental patterns, you can feel helpless. Thoughts happen to you. Emotions happen to you. You're a passive recipient of your internal experience. But when you move your body, you're doing something. You're actively participating in changing your state. That sense of agency itself is rewiring. Your brain learns, I'm not helpless. I can influence my experience. I have some control over my state. These aren't just comforting thoughts. They're neural pathways being built through the direct experience of choosing to move and feeling the effects. Over time, this builds what researchers call self-efficacy, the belief that you can influence outcomes through your actions. And self-efficacy is one of the strongest predictors of resilience and mental health. People with high self-efficacy don't necessarily have fewer problems, but they respond to problems differently because they believe they can do something about them. Movement builds this belief not through positive thinking, but through direct physical evidence. You were anxious, you moved, you felt different. You were stuck in rumination, you walked, your thoughts loosened. You were disconnected, you stretched, you felt more present. Your brain registers these cause and effect relationships and builds pathways around them. Here's a practice you can use during the day when you notice you're stuck. Do what some people call a state change movement. It can be anything: 10 jumping jacks, a quick walk around the block, dancing to one song, doing some stretches. The key is to do it consciously, with the intention of shifting your state. Notice what you feel like before, the quality of your thoughts, your energy level, your emotional tone. Then move for just a few minutes. Then notice again. What shifted? Even if it's subtle, even if it's just a slight loosening of tension or a small lift in energy, notice it. You're training your brain to recognize movement changes state. The more you practice this, the more automatic it becomes. Eventually, when you start to feel stuck or overwhelmed, your brain will spontaneously generate the impulse to move. Not because you should exercise more, but because movement has become a tool your brain knows how to use for regulation and rewiring. Some people worry that this is just avoidance, using movement to escape from feelings that need to be felt. But there's a difference. Avoidance is moving to not feel. Regulation is moving to be able to feel without being overwhelmed. Movement can actually help you access and process emotion by creating enough physiological safety to feel what you've been unable to feel. Remember the woman from earlier in this chapter, the one who started running? What she discovered over time wasn't that running made her anxiety disappear. It was that running gave her nervous system enough regulation that she could actually start to look at what was underneath the anxiety. The chronic worry had been so overwhelming that she couldn't get to the deeper feelings beneath it. Movement gave her the physiological capacity to go deeper. That's the paradox. Sometimes you have to change your physical state before you can do the emotional work that needs doing. Your nervous system needs to feel safe enough to access difficult material. Movement creates that safety. Tonight, as you prepare for sleep, remember that your body is part of your healing, not separate from it. Every time you move with awareness, every time you listen to what your body needs, every time you use physical action to shift your state, you're rewiring. You're building pathways between brain and body that will serve you in everything you do. Optional pause. If you'd like to reflect, consider, how does my body feel right now? What movement might it need? You don't have to do anything about it. Just notice. You may write, think, or continue listening. Whatever feels right is perfectly fine. As you sleep tonight, your brain will consolidate the movement patterns you practiced today. If you stretched, the neural pathways that connect to those muscles will strengthen. If you walked, The rhythm of that movement will process through your neural networks. If you danced or shook or moved expressively, the emotional release that happened will integrate into your system. Movement isn't just good for your body, it's essential for your brain. And the beautiful thing is that you don't need special equipment or a gym membership or a particular body type. You just need to move regularly with awareness in ways that feel good to you. Over time, you'll notice that patterns that seemed purely mental, anxiety, depression, rumination, numbness, start to shift as you change your relationship with physical movement. You're not just thinking differently, you're literally inhabiting your body differently. And from that different embodiment, different patterns become possible. Take a breath. Feel yourself in your body right now. When you're ready, let's move to the final chapter. Chapter 8. Connection. The context for all rewiring. She had been working on herself for years. Therapy, self-help books, meditation retreats, journaling practices. She'd made progress. She understood herself better. She had tools, but something still felt missing. She'd be making changes, feeling better. Then life would get stressful and she'd slip back into old patterns. It felt like she was doing all this work in isolation, and the isolation itself was part of the problem. Then something shifted when she joined a group, not a therapy group, just a community of people interested in similar things. She found herself being honest about her struggles. Others shared theirs. She realized she wasn't alone in the patterns she'd thought were uniquely her failures. And somehow, being witnessed by others, witnessing others in return, made the changes she was working toward feel more possible. She couldn't explain it exactly, but her nervous system seemed to relax in a way it never did when she was working on herself alone. This chapter is about why connection is the context for all rewiring, and why some of the most powerful changes happen not in isolation, but in relationship. Here's a fundamental truth about human brains. They didn't evolve to function in isolation. For almost all of human history, survival depended on belonging to a group. Your nervous system is wired to constantly assess: am I safe? Am I connected? Do I belong? These questions run beneath your conscious awareness, shaping everything about how you perceive and respond to the world. When you feel connected to other people, to a purpose, to something larger than yourself, your nervous system relaxes into a state that's optimal for learning, growing, and rewiring. When you feel isolated, your nervous system stays vigilant, defensive, focused on survival rather than growth. Why does this matter? Because you can do all the individual rewiring practices we've discussed: attention training, emotional work, compassionate self-talk, movement, and they'll help. But they'll work so much more powerfully if you're doing them in a context of connection rather than isolation. Think about why therapy works for so many people. Yes, the techniques and insights matter. But equally important is the relationship itself, the experience of being fully seen, accepted, and supported by another person while you do difficult work. That relational container creates the safety that allows deep change. You don't necessarily need formal therapy to access this. Any genuine connection where you feel safe enough to be honest about your struggles creates similar conditions for rewiring. Most people trying to change do it in secret. They're ashamed of their patterns, afraid of judgment, trying to fix themselves before anyone notices what's wrong. This secrecy itself maintains the patterns. When you hide something, you give it power. You reinforce the neural pathways of shame and isolation that often underlie the pattern in the first place. But when you can share what you're struggling with, when someone responds with understanding rather than judgment, something profound happens neurologically. Your brain gets new data. I can be flawed and still belong. I can struggle and still be worthy of connection. These insights don't just live in your thinking mind. They encode into your nervous system through the actual experience of being met with compassion. The woman who joined the group experienced this directly. For years, she believed her anxiety meant something was fundamentally wrong with her. She worked hard to hide it, to appear fine, to not burden anyone. Her brain learned anxiety equals isolation because showing anxiety means rejection. But in the group, when she tentatively shared her struggles, others nodded in recognition. Some shared similar experiences. No one recoiled or judged. Her brain received completely different information. Anxiety equals still belonging. This single experience began to rewire the shame and isolation that had been wrapped around her anxiety, making the anxiety itself easier to work with. This is why 12-step programs work for so many people, even though their methods seem simple. The healing isn't primarily in the steps. It's in the experience of being in community with others who understand, who witness your struggle without judgment, who remind you that you're not uniquely broken. This is why good support groups, online communities, even meaningful friendships where you can be honest create conditions for change. You're not just getting information or support. You're having a neurobiological experience of safe connection while vulnerable. And that experience rewires the foundational patterns of how you relate to yourself and others. The simplest practice is this: find at least one person, a friend, a therapist, a support group member, even an online community, with whom you can be honest about what you're actually experiencing. Not performing, not pretending, just honest. This feels risky. Your brain will generate reasons why you shouldn't. They'll think you're weak. They'll be burdened. They won't understand. It's self-indulgent to talk about yourself. These thoughts are your nervous system trying to protect you from the vulnerability of connection. But connection, real connection, is what your nervous system actually needs. You're a social species. Your brain is wired to heal in relationship. The everyday version involves small moments of authentic sharing. You don't have to have deep conversations about your trauma or patterns every day. Sometimes it's just being honest when someone asks how you are. Actually, I'm struggling today instead of I'm fine. Or it's sending a text to a friend. Having a hard moment. Just wanted to reach out. You're not necessarily asking them to fix anything. You're practicing the act of connection when you're vulnerable, rather than only connecting when you feel strong and capable. These small practices build neural pathways of secure attachment. Your brain learns, I can reach out when I need support. People are generally responsive. Connection is available to me. These pathways are foundational to resilience and well-being. The deeper version involves understanding that some of your patterns can only fully heal in relationship because they originated in relationship. If you learned as a child that expressing needs led to rejection, that pattern lives in the relational neural networks of your brain. Reading about it, thinking about it, even understanding it deeply, these help, but they might not fully change the pattern. What changes the pattern is having new relational experiences. Someone responds to your needs with care instead of rejection repeatedly until your brain updates its expectations. This is called corrective emotional experience, and it's one of the most powerful mechanisms of change. You can't force this to happen, but you can make yourself available to it. You can practice expressing needs, even small ones, with people who've proven to be safe. You can notice when someone responds differently than your brain expected. You can let that new information sink in rather than dismissing it as an exception. Many people struggle with this because they're waiting to feel ready, waiting to be healed before they connect. But it doesn't work that way. Connection is part of the healing, not something that happens after. You bring your imperfect, still healing self into relationship, and the relationship becomes part of the healing process. Chapter 9. The stories you've been living inside. There was a story she'd been telling herself for as long as she could remember. I'm not the kind of person who succeeds easily. I have to work twice as hard as everyone else just to keep up. She'd repeated this so many times, believed it so completely, that it had become invisible, not a story, but simply the truth about who she was. She organized her entire life around this story. She overworked constantly, preparing obsessively for things others seemed to handle casually. She interpreted every setback as confirmation that she was inherently behind, inherently lacking. When things went well, she attributed it to luck or explained it away rather than letting it challenge her core narrative. Then one day, someone asked her a simple question. What if that's not true? What if that's just a story you've been believing? The question irritated her at first. Of course it was true. She had evidence, years of experience. It wasn't a story, it was reality. But the question lingered, and slowly, she started to notice how much of her evidence was actually her interpreting neutral events through the lens of her story. How many opportunities had she not even pursued because the story told her she'd fail? How much energy had she spent reinforcing a narrative that might not be true at all? This chapter is about understanding that you're living inside stories about yourself, and that changing those stories is one of the most powerful forms of brain rewiring you can do. Your brain doesn't experience reality directly. It experiences reality through narratives, stories about who you are, what's possible for you, how the world works, what things mean. These narratives are so fundamental to how you process experience that you usually don't recognize them as stories. They just feel like truth, but they're not truth. They're interpretations shaped by your past experiences, your family patterns, your culture, the conclusions you drew when you were young and didn't have full information. And these stories literally shape your neural pathways, determining what you notice, what you remember, how you interpret events, and what actions feel possible. When you believe, I'm not good enough, your brain actively searches for evidence to confirm this. It highlights your mistakes and failures while filtering out or minimizing your successes. It interprets ambiguous situations negatively. It generates thoughts and feelings consistent with not good enoughness. And over time, this pattern becomes so automatic, so deeply wired, that it feels like an unchangeable fact about who you are. The same process happens with any core story. I'm unlovable. I'm not creative. Good things don't happen to me. I always mess up relationships. I'm not smart enough. I'm too much. I'm not enough. Whatever the specific narrative, your brain builds neural architecture around it, making the story feel increasingly real and unchangeable. Why does this matter? Because you can't rewire your brain while staying inside the same stories. You can learn new skills, develop new habits, change your behavior. But if the underlying story remains, I'm someone who fails, your brain will find ways to confirm that story, often sabotaging your progress unconsciously. Real rewiring requires becoming aware of your stories and consciously choosing to test them, question them, and potentially rewrite them. Not by forcing positive affirmations you don't believe, but by recognizing that your stories are just that, stories, not facts, and opening to the possibility that different stories might be equally true or more true. Most people don't realize they're living inside stories because the stories narrate their experience so constantly that they become the lens through which everything is seen. It's like wearing glasses you've had on so long you forgot you're wearing them. You just think the blurry or distorted view is how reality actually looks. The simplest practice for becoming aware of your stories is to start noticing the I am statements you make about yourself. I am anxious. I am bad at math. I am socially awkward. I am a perfectionist. I am not athletic. These statements, repeated over time, become neural pathways, shaping how your brain processes related experiences. When you catch yourself making an I am statement, pause and rephrase it as a story. I'm telling myself the story that I'm anxious. I have a belief that I'm bad at math. There's a narrative running that I'm socially awkward. This tiny linguistic shift creates crucial distance. You're no longer fused with the story. You're recognizing it as a mental construction that in that recognition, choice emerges. You can ask, is this story serving me? Is it true? Or is it just familiar? What evidence contradicts this story that I've been filtering out? What would be possible if this story weren't true? The everyday version involves tracking the stories that show up most frequently in your self-talk and your interpretation of events. Maybe you notice you have a story about being unlucky. When something goes wrong, you immediately think, of course this happened to me. Things never work out for me. Or you have a story about being forgettable. When someone doesn't respond to your message, you assume they're not interested rather than that they're busy. Start collecting these moments. Not to judge yourself, but to map the narrative landscape you're living in. What are the recurring themes? What stories have the most power over how you feel and what you do? The deeper practice involves tracing your stories back to their origins. Most core narratives were formed early, often based on limited or painful experiences that your young brain generalized into permanent truths. Maybe you struggled with reading in second grade and concluded, I'm not smart. Maybe your parents were inconsistently available and you concluded, I'm not important enough to be prioritized. Maybe you were rejected by a group of peers and concluded, I don't belong anywhere. These conclusions made sense given the information you had at the time. Your brain was trying to make meaning of painful experiences, trying to predict and prevent future pain. But the stories you created then have been running your life ever since, even though you're no longer that child, even though you have so much more information now. When you can trace a story back to its origin, you can start to separate the childhood conclusion from adult reality. You can acknowledge that experience was real, that pain was real, but the conclusion I drew, that I'm fundamentally flawed or unworthy or incapable, that was a child's attempt to make sense of something difficult. It's not necessarily true. This doesn't invalidate your experience. It creates space to hold both truths. The experience was real, and the story you built from it might not be accurate or helpful. Tonight, as you prepare for sleep, you might try this. Identify one core story you've been living inside. Maybe it's a story about your worthiness, your capability, your lovability, your place in the world. Get clear on what the story is. Write it down if that helps. The story I've been living inside is. Then ask yourself, what is this story costing me? How has it limited what I attempt, how I interpret my experiences, what I believe is possible, not to shame yourself, but to see clearly the impact of the narrative. Then ask, what evidence exists that contradicts this story? Your brain will resist this question because it's invested in the story. But push gently. There are always counterexamples, moments that don't fit the narrative, experiences that suggest a different story might be true. Let yourself see them. Finally, ask, what would be a different story, equally true or more true, that would serve me better? Not a fantasy story that has no grounding in reality, but a reframing that takes into account the full picture rather than the selective evidence your old story has been highlighting. Maybe instead of, I always fail, a more accurate story is, I've struggled with some things and succeeded at others, and I'm learning and growing. Instead of, I'm unlovable, maybe, I'm human with flaws and gifts, and some people connect with me deeply. Instead of, I'm not capable, maybe some things come easily to me and others require effort, and that's normal. These reframes aren't about positive thinking. They're about accuracy. They're about recognizing that your old stories were incomplete, selective interpretations, not objective truth. As you drift towards sleep, hold the new story lightly in your awareness. Not trying to force yourself to believe it, just introducing it as a possibility. What if this alternative story were true? What would my life look like? How would I interpret things differently? Your brain, in its receptive pre-sleep state, will begin to explore this possibility. It will start forming neural pathways around the new narrative, not replacing the old story overnight, but beginning to create alternative routes, different ways of interpreting yourself and your experience. One man who practiced this told me, I'd been living inside the story that I was damaged, that my difficult childhood had broken something in me that couldn't be fixed. That story informed everything. My relationships, my career choices, my sense of what I deserved. When I finally recognized it as a story, not truth, and started exploring a different narrative, that I was resilient, that I'd survived difficult things and learned from them, that my past gave me depth and compassion, my whole life shifted. Not my circumstances, but how I moved through them. That's what happens when you change your stories. The external world might stay the same, but your experience of it transforms. You notice different things. You interpret events differently. You take different actions because different things feel possible. And those changes create new experiences that reinforce the new story, building new neural pathways that eventually become as automatic as the old ones were. This is deep rewiring. You're not just changing thoughts or behaviors. You're changing the fundamental narratives that organize your experience of yourself and the world. And because your brain is a pattern-making, story-building organ, changing the stories changes everything. Optional pause. If you want to reflect, consider, what is one story I've been living inside that might not be completely true? What would a more accurate, more empowering story be? You may write, think, or simply continue listening. As you sleep tonight, your brain will work with whatever new possibilities you've introduced. It will begin to reorganize around new narratives, building pathways that support different interpretations, different feelings about yourself, different actions. This is subtle work happening below conscious awareness. But it's powerful. Tomorrow, you might catch yourself starting to tell the old story and pause. You might notice an experience that contradicts your old narrative and actually let it register instead of explaining it away. You might feel slightly different about yourself, slightly more open to possibilities that the old story foreclosed. These are signs that rewiring is happening. Not dramatic transformation, but genuine neural change. New stories creating new pathways, creating new experiences, creating stronger evidence for the new stories. It's a positive feedback loop, the opposite of the negative one you've been caught in. You've been living inside stories that were built from old information, old pain, old limitations. Tonight, you're beginning to write new ones, not by denying your past, but by refusing to let past conclusions determine your future. That's the power of recognizing that stories are stories, not truth, and that you have agency in which ones you continue to live inside. Take a breath. Notice what story is running right now about who you are. When you're ready, let's move to the final chapter. Chapter 10, Integration. Waking up different, she didn't notice the change at first. It wasn't dramatic or sudden, but about 3 weeks into her nightly practice, the breathing, the attention work, the conscious rewiring before sleep, something felt different. A situation that would normally send her into an anxious spiral happened, and she noticed herself responding with more calm than usual. Not perfect calm, not Zen enlightenment, just different. She paused and thought about it. When had that shift happened? She couldn't pinpoint a moment. It had been gradual, accumulating through repeated practice, until one day the new response was simply there, more accessible than the old one. That's when she understood. Rewiring isn't something you do once and complete. It's something that happens through integration, through taking what you've learned and practiced in intentional moments and allowing it to become part of how you naturally operate. This chapter is about integration, about how the work you've done tonight becomes lasting change, and what you need to know about maintaining and deepening the rewiring process. Everything you've explored in the previous chapters, understanding your patterns, working with your attention, engaging emotion, shifting language, using movement, creating safety, recognizing connection. These aren't meant to be one-time lessons. They're practices that need to be integrated into your life for real neural change to solidify. Your brain is always changing. Neuroplasticity never stops, but it works in both directions. You can build new pathways through practice, and you can lose them again through disuse. The question isn't whether your brain will change. It's what direction it will change in. If you do these practices tonight, but then return to your old patterns tomorrow. The same stress responses, the same self-talk, the same avoidance of emotion, the same disconnection from your body. Your brain will gradually revert to the old pathways. They're familiar. They're established. Without active maintenance of the new pathways, they'll weaken while the old ones reassert themselves. But if you continue practicing, even imperfectly, even inconsistently, the new pathways strengthen. They become more automatic. They start to compete with the old patterns, and eventually, in many situations, they become the default response. This is integration, the point where you don't have to consciously think about the new way of being. It's simply how you are now. Why does this matter? Because many people try a practice, feel some benefit, but then stop before integration happens. They think, that was nice, but they don't continue long enough for it to become wired in. Then they're confused when they find themselves back in the same old patterns. They think the practice didn't work, when really they just stopped before the work was complete. Real change requires consistency over time, not perfection. You'll miss days, you'll forget practices, you'll slip back into old patterns. That's normal. But if the overall trajectory is toward continued practice, toward returning to these tools again and again, integration will happen. The new pathways will solidify. The changes will stick. Think of it like learning a language. You can learn some phrases, use them a few times, feel proud of yourself. But if you don't continue practicing, you'll forget them. They won't integrate into your actual capability. But if you keep practicing, making mistakes, forgetting, and remembering, gradually the language becomes part of you. You don't have to consciously translate anymore. You just speak it, the same with rewiring your brain. The practices you've learned tonight are your new language, a language of self-awareness, emotional intelligence, conscious attention, compassionate self-relationship. At first, you'll have to deliberately practice. But with time, with consistency, this language becomes how you naturally operate. The simplest approach to integration is to choose one or two practices that resonated most with you tonight and commit to doing them daily, especially before sleep. Not all the practices, that would be overwhelming. Just one or two that felt most relevant, most helpful, most accessible. Maybe it's the breath work. 10 minutes of conscious breathing before bed every night. That's it. That's your practice. You do it consistently, and over weeks and months, your nervous system integrates this pattern. The calm it produces becomes more accessible throughout your day, not just during the practice time. Or maybe it's the practice of noticing your self-talk and gently reframing it. Several times a day, you catch yourself using harsh language and choose something more accurate and compassionate. You do this enough times, and eventually the compassionate voice becomes stronger than the critical one. You've rewired the default. The everyday version of integration involves creating cues and rituals that remind you to practice. Maybe you put a note by your bed. Breathe and release. Maybe you set a reminder on your phone for evening reflection time. Maybe you pair your practice with something you already do daily. After brushing your teeth, you do 5 minutes of body awareness. These external structures support the internal restructuring. You're giving yourself help remembering to practice until the practice becomes automatic enough that you don't need reminders. You might also track your practice in some simple way. Not obsessively, but just to maintain awareness. A check mark on a calendar when you do your evening practice. A brief note in your phone about what you noticed. Something that helps you see the accumulation of effort over time. The consistency that leads to integration. The deeper aspect of integration involves understanding that you'll have setbacks, and setbacks are part of the process, not evidence of failure. You'll have days or weeks where stress is high, and you revert to old patterns completely. This doesn't mean you've lost all your progress. It means you're human. The old pathways never completely disappear. They just become less dominant. Under high stress, your brain might default to them because they're familiar and feel safer in the moment. That's okay. You notice it happened. You return to your practices when you're able, and you continue. The new pathways are still there. You haven't erased your work. What matters is the long-term pattern. Are you, over time, spending more moments operating from the new pathways than the old ones? Are you returning to your practices more quickly after getting derailed? Are you catching yourself in old patterns more often and choosing differently? If yes to any of these, integration is happening. Even if it doesn't feel smooth or linear, another dimension of integration is allowing your understanding to deepen. When you first learned these practices tonight, you understood them conceptually. But as you actually practice them, as you encounter your own resistance, your own patterns, your own unique blocks, your understanding becomes embodied. You're not just knowing about rewiring, you're living it. This embodied knowing is integration at its deepest. You don't just understand that attention shapes neural pathways. You've experienced how deliberately shifting your attention creates different feelings, different responses. You don't just know that self-compassion matters. You've felt the difference in your nervous system when you speak to yourself kindly versus harshly. This experiential learning creates stronger neural change than intellectual understanding alone ever could. So, part of integration is staying curious about your direct experience, noticing what actually happens when you practice, learning from your own process rather than just following instructions. Tonight, as you prepare for sleep after this full journey, you might try this integration practice. Review what you've learned over these 10 chapters, not to memorize it, but to notice what resonated most. What practices felt most accessible or helpful? What insights landed most deeply? What do you want to continue exploring? Then, set an intention for integration. I'm committing to specific practice daily for the next specific time frame. Be realistic. Don't commit to doing everything every day. That's a setup for failure. Choose one or two things you can actually maintain, even on difficult days. Maybe it's, I'm committing to 10 minutes of conscious breathing before sleep every night for the next month. Or, I'm committing to noticing my self-talk and reframing it compassionately at least 3 times a day. Whatever you choose, make it specific, achievable, and meaningful to you. Write it down. Tell someone about it if that helps with accountability. Create whatever structure you need to support following through, because following through is how integration happens as you drift towards sleep tonight. Know that the work of integration is already beginning. Your brain is consolidating everything you've learned and practiced. Neural pathways are forming, strengthening, preparing to become your new normal. You don't have to force this. You just have to keep practicing, keep returning, keep choosing the new way even when the old way is louder and more familiar. Over time, and we're talking weeks and months, not days, you'll notice that responses that required conscious effort become more automatic. Thought patterns that took deliberate redirecting start to shift naturally. Emotional regulation that felt like work becomes easier. Physical tension that was chronic begins to release more readily. You'll have moments where you realize, I just handled that differently than I would have before. Or, that thought arose but didn't hook me the way it used to. Or, I'm feeling stressed but not overwhelmed. There's more space around it. These moments are evidence that integration is happening, that the practices are working, that your brain is genuinely rewiring. One woman described it this way. After about 2 months of nightly practice, I was in a meeting that would have normally sent me into panic. My old pattern was immediate catastrophizing. I'm going to say something stupid. Everyone will judge me. I'm going to fail. But in this meeting, that thought started to arise, and I just observed it. Didn't follow it. Took a breath. Participated normally. Afterward, I sat in my car amazed. I didn't consciously try to do anything different. The new response was just there, available, because I'd been practicing it every night. That's integration. That's the goal. Not that you'll never have difficult thoughts or feelings again, but that you'll have more choice in how you respond to them. The practices you've done intentionally, repeatedly, become part of how you naturally operate. And here's something beautiful. As you integrate these practices, as your brain rewires, you'll notice positive changes rippling out into areas of your life you weren't directly working on. Your relationships might improve because you're more present, more regulated, more compassionate. Your work might feel less overwhelming because your nervous system isn't constantly activated. Your physical health might improve because chronic stress decreases that you're not just changing specific behaviors. You're changing the foundation of how you relate to yourself and your experience. And that foundational change affects everything. Optional pause. If you want to reflect, consider, what practice from tonight do I want to commit to integrating? What support do I need to maintain consistency? What would my life look like 6 months from now if I actually practiced this regularly? You may write, think, or simply continue listening. As you move into sleep now. After this full journey through all 10 chapters, let yourself feel a sense of completion. Not of the work, that continues, but of this particular learning, this introduction to how rewiring works and what's possible that you've learned the theory and the practice. You've explored different dimensions of change. You've been given tools that, used consistently, will genuinely reshape your neural pathways. Now the work of integration begins, the daily practice, the returning when you forget, the accumulation of small efforts that create lasting change. You might wake tomorrow and feel inspired to practice everything perfectly. More likely, you'll wake tomorrow and life will immediately start making demands, and you'll forget everything you learned tonight. Both are fine. What matters is that sometime tomorrow, maybe in the evening, maybe before bed, you remember. You return. You practice even a little. And then you do it again the next day. And the next, that's how rewiring happens. Not through one perfect night, but through imperfect, consistent practice over time. Through choosing differently, again and again, until the new choice is the natural one that you have everything you need. The knowledge, the practices, the understanding of how your brain works. Now it's just about doing it, about living it, about allowing integration to happen through repeated engagement. As you sleep tonight, all the learning from these 10 chapters will consolidate. Your brain will organize the information, strengthen the pathways you've been activating, prepare you to wake up tomorrow with just slightly more capacity for conscious choice, for deliberate rewiring, for creating the neural architecture that serves your well-being. This is the beginning, not the end. Tomorrow morning, you begin the practice of integration, of turning tonight's learning into lasting change. And every night after, you have the opportunity to return to these practices, to continue the work, to keep rewiring your brain in directions that serve you. Take a breath. Feel yourself here at the end of this journey and the beginning of the next. When you're ready, rest. Sleep deeply. Let your brain do the work of integration while you rest. And wake tomorrow ready to practice, to live, to embody the change you've been learning about. Thank you for being here. Thank you for committing to your own rewiring. Thank you for being willing to change, even though change is difficult, even though it requires consistent effort, even though results aren't immediate or dramatic. The work you're doing matters. For you, and for everyone whose life you touch. As you change, as you become more conscious, more regulated, more compassionate with yourself, you become a different presence in the world that ripples outward in ways you might never fully see. Rest well. Integrate deeply, and wake tomorrow ready to continue this work of rewiring your brain, one practice at a time, one day at a time, one night at a time. By morning, you'll be different. Not completely transformed, but different. And that's how all lasting change begins. Good night. There's also power in being the witness for someone else. When you listen to another person's struggles with genuine presence and compassion, you're not just helping them. You're also rewiring your own patterns. You're practicing seeing difficulty without judgment. You're building neural pathways of empathy and connection. Often, offering others what you wish you'd received is part of your own healing. Tonight, before sleep, you might reflect on your connections. Who in your life knows what you're actually going through? Who could you be more honest with? Where have you been protecting yourself through isolation? You don't have to act on this immediately. Just bringing awareness to it plants a seed. Your brain begins to consider, maybe connection is possible. Maybe I don't have to do everything alone. You might also think about a moment of genuine connection you've experienced, a time when someone really saw you, or when you really saw someone else. Let yourself remember how that felt. That feeling is what your nervous system is designed for. It's not a luxury or a bonus. It's fundamental to your well-being and to your capacity for change. There's another dimension of connection that matters for rewiring. Connection to something larger than yourself. This doesn't have to be religious or even spiritual in a traditional sense. It's about feeling part of something that transcends your individual concerns. For some people, this is nature. They feel connected to something vast and ancient when they're in wild places. For others, it's creativity, music, art, writing, where they touch something that feels bigger than their personal story. For others, it's service, contributing to something meaningful. For others still, it's a spiritual or religious practice. Whatever form it takes, this sense of connection to something larger has a regulating effect on your nervous system. It provides perspective. It loosens the grip of self-focused anxiety and rumination. It reminds your brain that you're part of something ongoing, something that existed before you and will continue after you, and somehow that's comforting rather than diminishing. When you feel connected to something larger, the patterns you're trying to change start to feel less defining. Yes, you struggle with anxiety, but you're also part of the natural world, which has been unfolding for billions of years. Yes, you have difficult habits, but you're also contributing to something meaningful. The patterns are real, but they're not all of who you are. This sense of context, this awareness that you're more than your struggles, itself creates neurological changes. The neural pathways of self-focused rumination quiet down. The pathways associated with awe, perspective, and meaning activate. These aren't trivial changes. They're fundamental shifts in how your brain organizes experience. The simplest way to access this is to regularly spend time doing something that connects you to something larger. Walk in nature and really pay attention, not thinking about your problems, but noticing the trees, the sky, the aliveness of everything. Listen to music that moves you. Create something, anything. Help someone. Read something that expands your sense of what's possible, that you're not escaping your patterns. You're placing them in a larger context where they have less power to define you. Tonight, as you prepare for sleep, consider, what makes me feel connected to something larger than my individual concerns? When was the last time I felt that connection? Is there a way to invite more of that into my life? Again, you don't have to answer definitively. You're just opening your mind to the possibility that connection, to people, to purpose, to something transcendent, is part of what allows rewiring to happen and stick. Optional pause. If you want to reflect, ask yourself, where in my life do I have genuine connection? Where am I isolated? What would it look like to take one small step toward more connection? You may write, think, or simply continue listening. Whatever feels right for you is perfectly fine. As you move towards sleep tonight, know that you're not on this journey alone, even if it sometimes feels that way. Every person struggling to change patterns, to grow, to heal, you're all part of the same human process. The specifics differ, But the fundamental challenge is the same: learning to be with yourself and others with more compassion, more awareness, more capacity for both feeling and choosing. The work you're doing, the attention you're bringing to your own rewiring, ripples outward. As you change your patterns, you change how you show up in relationships. As you develop more compassion for yourself, you naturally offer more compassion to others. As you heal, you become a presence that helps others feel safe enough to begin their own healing. This isn't pressure. You don't have to be perfect or enlightened to be helpful to others. You just have to be honest, present, and willing to be seen in your imperfection. That itself is healing for you and for others. As you sleep tonight, all the work you've done in all these chapters, in all these practices, will consolidate in your brain. The new pathways will strengthen. The old patterns will loosen just a bit more. And tomorrow morning, you'll wake up slightly different than you are right now, not dramatically transformed, not without struggles or patterns, but different, more aware, more connected to yourself, more capable of choosing how you respond rather than being entirely at the mercy of automatic reactions. That's all rewiring is: small, persistent shifts that accumulate over time until one day you realize you're experiencing yourself and your life differently. Take a breath. Feel the fullness of this moment. When you're ready, let's move to the closing.